So let's say that I'm a scientist and a bright idea strikes me, or I'm an artist and a bright intuition strikes me. Now, I have two options when I'm considering that source. I could consider that a manifestation of the same spirit of intuition and revelation that has made itself manifest as part and parcel of the creative enterprise of all of mankind since the dawn of time, right? A continuance of that same process, which insinuates something transpersonal about it, right? It's the operation of something transcendent. Or I can take personal credit for it and say, I thought it up. Now, the problem with the latter approach, as far as I can tell, is, first of all, I think it's incautious and unwarranted because, you know, the great scientists have always said that they stand on the shoulders of giants and can see farther for that reason. Is we are part of a great collective creative enterprise, and God only knows how deep that goes. But then there's also the terrible threat of self-deification that might otherwise make itself manifest, you know, and I see that emerging in our culture. I see part of what's happening in our culture, a kind of extension of demented Protestantism, where instead of the God that revealed itself to Moses saying, I am what I am, it's the individual person who says, I am what I am. I get to define myself. I'm the source of all wisdom and revelation, my brain, my psyche, my subjectivity, with no humility in that regard. And I actually think that that's a devastating cultural impropriety because it elevates the subjective intellect to the status of God, and that's a Luciferian crime.
It is, absolutely, and specifically a Luciferian crime, because the temptation, you shall be as gods, is in the very first pages of Genesis. And it fascinates me that the temptation came in a very clever way, giving the impression that God wants to hold you humans down. He doesn't want you to rise to his level. Don't you realize if you go against his word, then you will rise in the hierarchy of being and you will be as gods knowing good and evil. And what fascinates me about that, Dr. Peterson, is this. In the first section of Genesis, you have God's word creating the universe, and God said, and God said, and God said. In the second part, you have God's word in a prohibition defining morality. And the first humans are encouraged to go against it by being promised godhood and the knowledge of good and evil. Not knowledge, of course. God wanted them to have lots of knowledge. It was the knowledge of good and evil that nobody wants. And what I see in current society, and I very much applaud your stance on this, because it seems to me that the whole Homo Deus phenomenon, as, for example, illustrated in the book by Yuval Noah Harari on artificial intelligence, this idea of transhumanism, that actually we should go for this and turn human beings into gods, seems to me to be incredibly dangerous. And it's the height of pride, arrogance, and it is very destructive.
Okay, so in the late 1800s, when Nietzsche observed that God was dead, it was a very complex observation, because people like to think of that as a triumphalist proclamation by this emancipatory philosopher. And that wasn't the case at all, because Nietzsche basically said that God was dead and we'd killed him and we'll never find enough water to wash away the blood, right? I mean, he knew it was a catastrophe. And he prophesied that three things would happen. One would be that there would be a wicked turn towards a kind of hopeless nihilism, because every structure of morality had fallen apart. The second would be the rise of totalitarian substitutions for God, and Nietzsche actually specified communism as a likely candidate, and also prophesied that hundreds of millions of people would die as a consequence, which was quite the damn prophecy for the late 1800s. And then he also said, but the alternative is that we could create our own values. And that was the route that Nietzsche saw as the way out. Now, there's a couple of problems with that, technical problems, you might say. One is, well, we don't live very long, and it isn't obvious that any of us singly is wise enough to create our own values. The second problem is, as the psychoanalysts pointed out very quickly, it isn't obvious at all that we're masters in our own houses, because even if you only look at the spiritual realm as equivalent to something like the unconscious, we're all haunted beings, and we can't necessarily trust our judgment. And the third problem, there's four. The third problem is that, well, who do you mean by the we that will create our own values? Like, which aspect of the psyche is now going to create value? Nietzsche said himself that each drive tends to philosophize in its own spirit. And so in order for us to create our own values in some sort of transcendent sense, you have to hypothesize the hierarchical integration of the psyche towards some superordinate end, and that's speaking in some voice. And it isn't obvious to me at all that that would be a subjective voice. I think it would be akin. So what happens with Moses is when he investigates the burning bush, he goes deeper and deeper into the investigation. And the first thing that happens is, well, his attention is attracted. The second thing is that he starts to notice that he's treading on sacred ground, right? Because he's getting deep into the phenomenon. And the third thing that happens is that, and this is relevant to your notion of levels of revelation, is that the voice of being itself speaks to him, right? The eternal, transcendent voice of being. And Moses is smart enough, he's wise enough to know that that's not him, right? It's something above and beyond him. And he doesn't take credit for it. And that's partly why he never turns into a pharaoh in the desert, right? He separates himself from the source of sovereignty as such. And I don't see how that can be done in the rationalist, atheist, materialist realm of conceptualization. You fall into that subjectivist trap. Okay.
Nor do I. And I think Nietzsche, in that sense, was a kind of prophet. And we're seeing the damage done. You know, ever since I was very young, I was fascinated by the polar opposite of my Christian heritage. And that has led me to spend quite a lot of time in Russia. And I've talked about these kind of things to Russian friends, many of whom suffered in the Gulag. And I remember one conversation with a leading academician, and he said to me, he said, you know, John, he said, we thought we could get rid of God and retain a value for human beings. And we woke up too late to realize that it cannot be done. And it was Nietzsche that said, if you destroy God, you lose all right to the kind of values that we accept, in a sense, deep down in our Judeo-Christian culture. And what is so interesting about Moses, and I loved your discussion about that, is that he came face to face not only with the concept of transcendence, but transcendence itself. And he was brought into the presence of the very glory of God. And you were discussing in your round table how in Hebrew, kavod, glory is associated with weight. And that leads me to think, relevant to what you've just said, about C.S. Lewis. I'm old enough to have listened to C.S. Lewis, by the way, when I was younger. And C.S. Lewis in the 1940s saw exactly what was going to happen if a group of human beings took it into their heads to determine and redefine all future generations through genetic experimentation and so on. And in two books, The Abolition of Man and That Hideous Strength, he spelled that out. And he made the point that if that happens, it is not going to liberate human beings. In fact, it's going to abolish them. Because what will be created by, say, playing around with the germline is not human beings, but artifacts. And so he writes, the final triumph of humanity, scientists, will be the abolition of man. And it's that I fear is really permeating our culture. I mean, the Caesars in Rome and the Babylonian emperors who thought of themselves as gods looks pretty trivial stuff compared with this insidious teaching that's around in particularly the Western world today, that we are actually all gods and we ought to rise to this. And the only way to rise to it is to reject the transcendent completely. There is nothing above us.
Okay, so let's delve into that a little bit, because the devil's always in the details. And so, you know, when I had little kids, I thought once about my son when he was about 3. And, you know, there's a terrible fragility to children, right? And I mean, adults are fragile, obviously. We all are, because we're mortal and vulnerable and prone to suffering. And I thought about my 3-year-old son, you know, and I thought, well, he has this terrible vulnerability. Wouldn't it be good if that could be ameliorated? Now, you can do that two ways. You can institute protective mechanisms that shield them from the depredations of the world. or you can strive to make them into the sort of competent people that can take the world on their own, right? And it's akin to the gospel ideas, I would say, that you can learn to handle serpents, and that's your best defense against serpents. Is that way you get to have the benefits of being and develop into someone simultaneously capable of bearing the weight of being, let's say. And I don't know if you can have being without it having a weight. I don't even know. It's possible that mortal limitation is the price you pay for being. I don't know how things are constructed.
It could well be. What you're saying reminds me of Dostoevsky, who said that he couldn't imagine a great person who had not known some kind of suffering. And what we try to do with our children is somehow to limit that. But we realize that part of their maturing has to do with how they learn to handle life. And we don't want to leave them defenseless, do we? So what you're raising is a very big set of questions. Now, you mentioned that transhumanism attempts to solve some of this vulnerability. And of course, some things are very good. I wear glasses and they enhance my vision and they're very important. But this idea of Harari's, where he sets two agenda items for the 21st century, firstly, to abolish physical death, to solve it as a technical medical problem, and then to enhance human happiness by genetic engineering and cyborg engineering and so forth. I take a very radical view of that. When people hold out this promise to me, I simply say to them, you're too late. The problem of physical death was solved 20 centuries ago, because I think there's strong evidence that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And the problem, therefore, of developing some kind of immortality was simultaneously solved with that, because Christ promises to those that trust him and follow him that he will eventually raise them from the dead, and that will be the best uploading you can ever imagine of brains, body, and everything else. So I take a very radical view that the transhumanist ideal is bound to fail, and there are deeper reasons behind that as well.
Well, so there's also a biological truism on the genetic front. And so, for example, and it's summed up in the phrase, there is no breeding for evolutionary fitness. Like you cannot rationally breed a variant of cattle, for example, that are going to be more successful at surviving in the ecology of cattle. It's not possible. And part of the reason for that, as far as I can tell, it's a deep problem. Part of the reason for that is that the horizon of the future actually transforms unpredictably. Like actually unpredictably, technically unpredictably. It's not deterministic. And what that means is that you cannot make a rational calculation that will determine a priori what direction evolution should go in order to be more successful. And it's also for that reason that what the evolutionary process does is capitalize on actual random chance in order to produce variants that can meet the transforming horizon of the future. And so, now, the theory has been forever that genetic mutation is random. And part of the reason for that is that part of its mechanism, there are a variety, one of its mechanisms is the damage of DNA molecules by cosmic rays, which is definitely random. But there was a study published a year ago or 2 years ago in Nature. This is so interesting and bears on our issues here, that even though the mechanism of variability at the DNA molecule level is truly random, there are repair mechanisms that fix damage to DNA molecules. And there's a hierarchy of genes such that some genes are so crucial to morphological development that if they mutate, death is virtually certain, or severe limitation, right, on the reproductive front, virtually certain. Whereas there are other variations that are permissible within the realm of likely survivability. And the accuracy of the repair mechanisms is proportionate to the depth of profundity of the genetic code. The genes that are most crucial to survival are repaired with 100% accuracy. So there's room for variation at the fringe. Now, the reason I brought that up is partly because there's an implication in the futurist, post-humanist types that they could breed a better person by rational means. But that means accepting the proposition a priori that you can compute what constitutes better rationally, that you actually know enough about that. And that's also a derivation of the notion that we can create our own values. And I don't think any of that's actually tenable. I think it's likely to produce all sorts of catastrophic, unpredicted outcomes. That's much more likely. Like those would be mutations that are counterproductive in every way, so to speak. That's much more likely than the notion that we're going to hit the target more squarely by mucking about with our Luciferian rationality.
I think that's absolutely right, but it raises a number of other questions, because the tacit assumption against a lot of this, and it was formulated recently, that evolution has brought us to where we are in the present, and intelligent design will bring us to our stated goal in the future. And I, like you, I deny the second proposition. But the first is beginning to look very shaky indeed. Now, I'm not a biologist, but I do study a lot of the recent developments called the third wave in biology, which are associated with systems biology, Dennis Noble and James Shapiro and so on, who now question seriously the whole Darwinian scheme, the neo-Darwinist explanation, because although it still accounts for variation, they're now pretty clear it accounts for very little else. And statements like Lynn Margulis saying that it's dead, and my colleague here, Dennis Noble, who founded systems biology, says that it's not fit for purpose, it doesn't need to be modified, and therefore replaced. And therefore, I suppose part of my skepticism comes from mathematics. We've always been skeptical about the idea that random processes can increase information as distinct from variant. So I have huge problems with this, which is why I wrote a book about it recently. So the two problems are, for me, one, I do not really believe that Darwinian evolution does all that people think it does. It certainly does something. But secondly, that looking towards the future, the idea that we will take it into our hands and intelligently move towards the goal of a superhuman, I think is immensely dangerous, because it's the creation of God. And there's a lovely little quote from a conference recently that I picked up, a biology conference, and a student was there, and she said, "Oh, it sounds as if you're creating God," to the speaker. And he says, exactly, that is exactly what we're trying to do. And I do think that's doomed to failure for the reasons that you have been so explicit about.
Yeah, well, you might aim at creating God, but that doesn't mean that the transcendent entity that you produce will be God.
Absolutely not.
So, right. I mean, you'd have to have a fair bit of hubris to assume that you would hit the target that exactly. So I've been thinking about, you mentioned when we were talking about the dangers of transhumanism and the abolition of man, you rightly pointed out very rapidly that, well, you have reading glasses and you're pretty damn happy with that. You have these prostheses that help you ameliorate your vulnerability, and you wouldn't give them up, and you do recognize them as positive goods. And, and you could say with a fair bit of credibility that the fact that you have reading glasses is one way that you've transcended your mortal limitations.
Sure.
Now, not entirely. Now we're faced with the problem of, given our advanced technological capability, there are a variety of biological limitations that in principle we could transcend. And then we might say, well, which of those should we transcend? And so I have a complicated answer to that. You tell me what you think about this. I thought a long while back about the problem of lying, because it's reasonable for a young child, or a young adult for that matter, to ask the question, well, why shouldn't I just lie all the time if I can get what I want and I can avoid unpleasant responsibility by doing so? And every child knows this, and every adult for that matter, which is why we lie, because we assume that we can shirk off a certain unpleasant responsibility, or we can gain an opportunity, and what the hell, why not do it? And so I thought about that for a long time. It's like, well, what exactly is the problem here? And then I realized, there'll be times in your life where very, very complicated dilemmas will confront you, like life and death situations. And you'll be suffering, and so will the people around you, and that will be no joke. And then you bloody well better have a clear head at that moment, because if you make the wrong decision, you're going to take the catastrophe that surrounds you and you're really going to turn it into something indistinguishable from hell. And then you might say, well, how can you be sure that you have a clear head when the storms come? And the answer is, well, how about if you don't allow the detritus in your vision to accumulate voluntarily, right? How about you don't blind yourself with lies? How about you don't pollute the very mechanism that orients you in the world, so that you have something to rely on when the difficulties come? And I would say maybe it's the same thing on the moral front, right? Because maybe the answer to what should our limitations be on the scientific front isn't a list of prohibitions in the explicit knowledge realm, but something like, we should bloody well be sure that if we're going to be good scientists, that we're truly ethically oriented, so that when a technological possibility makes itself manifest to us, we have enough wisdom to judge whether or not that's a direction that wise people would walk down. So I read this book a while back. It was written by a KGB agent, and he purported to have knowledge of chemical weapons research program in the former Soviet Union. And the goal of the program was to generate a hybrid of Ebola and smallpox, and then to aerosolize it for large-scale distribution. And he reported that the Soviets had killed a number of people, 500 or so, accidentally as a release of some of the chemical compounds or biological compounds this lab had been producing. But, you know, it made me think, because technically, scientifically, outside the realm of ethics and subjective value, there's no reason why. How might we breed a Ebola smallpox hybrid? There's no reason that that's not a valid scientific question, right? From the perspective of the pure facts. If the facts have no value, then any fact is worth pursuing. Any knowledge is worth pursuing. But if you're sensible and you look at something like that, you think, well, if you're an ethical scientist and you think something like, should I hybridize smallpox and Ebola? The answer should be no, right? That's just a road you're not going to walk down. And if you have any wisdom, it's going to be obvious that that's a bad road. And so it also seems to me that in order to deal with the catastrophic possibilities of the post-human realm, that we're going to have to become wise enough as scientists not to make that sort of egregious Luciferian error. And I don't think we can do that by abandoning our traditional metaphysics. I think that won't work, to say the least.
Absolutely, it won't work, because what we're raising now is a parallel question to the question of truth. It's the question of the existence of the concepts of right and wrong and defining them. And if you've got no transcendent reference point, you end up with Dostoevsky rightly saying, if God does not exist, then everything is permissible. He didn't mean that atheists couldn't behave. Of course they can. But he meant there's no rational justification for distinguishing between right and wrong. And we got to face that. On the question of lying, it's very interesting to me that the whole condition humaine arose from the lie originally. You shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. And you were talking about people thinking, why shouldn't I lie, and so on. Well, of course, one of the arguments is that people who take that view, if you lie to them and accuse them of something they don't believe to be true, for instance, accuse them of murder or theft or something like that, you'll soon see that they believe in truth and they want the truth about themselves to be known. So it's entirely inconsistent. Of course, it's up to them to take that view if they want to, but it's not one of those things that follows one of your rules of life, that you want to be able to apply to others what you apply to yourself.
Đơn vị là dây. Đó là xong nội dung cái bài số 1 của mình. Bây giờ chúng ta cùng đi qua cái bài số 2. Hình 2.1 là dao động điều hòa của một vật. Hãy xác định biên độ, chu kỳ, tần số của dao động. Đây, các bạn coi chú ý điều này nha. Biên độ dựa vào đồ thị các bạn muốn tìm biên độ thì đó chính là độ lệch cực đại của nó so với vị trí cân bằng. Đây là trục OX của các bạn đây. Đây là vị trí cân bằng O của chúng ta đây. Như vậy nó lệch, đoạn này là xa nhất, được chưa? Và cái đoạn dưới này cũng là xa nhất, hai đoạn này bằng nhau. Và như vậy chúng ta thấy từ 0 đến 0,2 đó chính là biên độ. Vậy các bạn trả lời biên độ nó là 0,2, đơn vị là mét hay là bằng 20 cm. Đó là xong. Câu tiếp theo nó hỏi chu kỳ T. Được chưa? Chu kỳ T này chúng ta tính như thế nào đây? Các bạn chú ý một điều này cho thầy. Chúng ta nhìn vào đường tròn lượng giác, chúng ta nhìn vào đồ thị nè. Thời gian nó đi từ vị trí cân bằng đi lên tới vị trí biên dương là ở đây. Đúng không ạ? Nó hết thời gian là 0,1 giây. Các bạn chú ý, đi từ vị trí cân bằng lên tới biên dương hết 0,1 giây. Như vậy các bạn mở cái đường tròn lượng giác ra nè. Các bạn coi nè. Đây là biên dương, nó là 2. Đây là biên âm, nó là -2. Đây là vị trí cân bằng. Đúng không ạ? Thì con lắc này nó sẽ dao động, bắt đầu nó xuất phát từ vị trí cân bằng đi về biên dương. Đúng không? Nó xuất phát từ vị trí cân bằng đi về biên dương thì ứng với cái chất điểm chuyển động từ vị trí M0 nè, bắt đầu nó chuyển động như thế này, tức là chiếu lên nó bằng 0 đây. Được chưa? Và nó chạy, nó quay như thế này thì tức là nó chuyển động về biên dương. Đúng không ạ?